July 4th, 1776. A day that lives in infamy. It was the day that 56 delegates amongst 13 British colonies signed the Declaration of Independence, formally separating themselves from the British Empire. These men took a great risk since their actions were treasonous, and if they had failed, it would have cost them their lives. But the war for independence wasn't only won by 56 men. It took many others, many of them women. We can't cover all of them, but we can highlight a few of the ladies who made a difference in shaping the independence of a nation. There's Tough, and then there's Nancy Hart Tough. Growing up in the frontier was a challenge. Living was rough, and nothing came easy. It wasn't a place for the weak, and only the strong prospered. Lucky for Nancy, she was born with a robust and hard-hitting disposition, a trait that would prove useful when she single-handedly fought off British loyalists from commandeering her property. Although Nancy was connected politically, her toughness and fearless spirit were by far her most dominant trait. She stood about 6 feet tall and was scarred from a smallpox infection. She survived. One day, a Whig party member was on the run and hotly pursued by the Tories. The Whigs stopped by Nancy Hart's cabin, and Hart's aide had been enlisted to help the party member. When the Tories showed up and questioned Nancy, they didn't believe her story when she denied ever seeing the Whig. The men were suspicious, and seeing a prize turkey in her possession, one of the men shot it and demanded that Nancy cook the bird for him. While the men were eating the turkey and drinking the wine that she served them, Nancy saw their muskets in the corner. Each time she walked past, she would remove a gun and pass it out of the window to her daughter Suki, whom Nancy had sent to get water, and secretly alert the neighbors that the Tories were holding them captive. Eventually, the men noticed the weapons were missing, and they stood up to confront Nancy, who soundly shot 2 of them, holding the others until her husband and his brigade arrived home. When the brigade arrived, the Tories were hanged. In 1912, workmen grading a railroad near the site of the old Hart cabin unearthed a row of 6 skeletons that lay under nearly 3 feet of earth and were estimated to have been buried for at least a century, confirming the deeds of Nancy's heroics. Women's education was always top of the list for Abigail Adams. She fought, petitioned, and was the confidant of an American president. Her accomplishments set the tone for the betterment of women's rights for many ages to come. As the Declaration of Independence was being drafted, Abigail wrote a letter to her husband asking him to
remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors.
Although this letter is often cited as a demonstration of Abigail's support for women's rights, the subject was more related to the education of women rather than women voting. In 1778, she wrote her husband that,
"You need not be told how much female education is neglected, nor how fashionable it has been to ridicule female learning."
In 1797, John Adams was elected president. Although Abigail was not present during his inauguration due to tending to her 89-year-old sick mother, she was very active during his presidency. Her opponents would refer to her as Mrs. President. Abigail was John's greatest confidant, and she was well versed on current events and issues, sometimes communicating them in letters. At times, she would serve as something of a press secretary, planning favorable news stories about her husband in the press. Although women would not win the right to vote for over a century after her death, Abigail Adams did her part to procure equality as best she could in the era she lived in, serving as a model for the female champions that would come later. One of those early champions would do the unthinkable. She would win her freedom from slavery, not by use of force, but by having her day in court. Anything is possible. At least that's what Elizabeth Freeman proved. She was born into slavery in a time when she was expected to accept her fate. Somehow, she found a way to sue the pants off a ruling household and win her freedom. Not by the sword, but by convincing a jury. It was 1744 in Claverack, New York, when Elizabeth Freeman was born. She was enslaved by Peter Hodgeboom, where she was given the name Bet. Her real triumph came in 1780, when words of the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution would inspire her to move forward towards her freedom. Bet lived in John Ashley's household. Ashley was a Yale-educated lawyer, wealthy landowner, businessman, and community leader. His house was the site of many political discussions and the probable location of the signing of the Sheffield Declaration, which predated the United States Declaration of Independence. Bet may have overheard the words spoken from the Constitution.
All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness.
Having heard this spoken, Bet rationed that the law should mean freedom to slaves. She sought legal counsel from Theodore Sedgwick, a colleague of Ashley's, to help her sue for freedom in court. Sedgwick accepted the case as well as that of Brom, another person Ashley enslaved. And together, they sought to change history in the case of Brom and Bet versus Ashley. The jury agreed that Brom and Bet were never the property of Ashley's to begin with, and that they were free people. Bet then changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman, who was offered to return to the Ashley house as a paid servant. She respectfully declined. She instead worked for the Sedgwick family as governess of the household. She was a critical person in the upbringing of the Sedgwick children, and she eventually was able to buy her own home. She died in December of 1829 and is the only non-Sedgwick to be buried in the family plot. Her courage, perseverance, and quick thinking carved a legal precedence for arguments that would ultimately outlaw slavery. Although her battles were seldom physical, there was another lady of the Revolution that settled the score with the British, and a fashion few women in that time had ever dared to try. Don't play in the mud. Always be courteous. Don't join the army. Great advice for a woman living in the 18th century. When Deborah Samson heard this, she said, "We'll just see about that." A war hero of the American Revolution, Deborah Samson disguised herself as a man so she could fight for her future country. Deborah stood tall at 5'7", taller than the average man, who was at that time 5'5". She was just 16 years old when the Americans declared their independence from Britain, and by 1782, she had enough. She tried to enlist in the army twice. The first time was early in the year, when she enlisted as Timothy Thayer. She was quickly discovered and repaid part of the bonus she received with no further punishment. The Baptist church to which she belonged learned of her actions and withdrew its fellowship, meaning that its members refused to associate with her unless she apologized and asked for forgiveness. Never one to back down from a fight, she enlisted again, this time in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, under the name Robert Shurtleff. She joined the Light Infantry Company of 4th Massachusetts Regiment under the command of Captain George Webb. In July of that year, during a skirmish, Deborah was shot in the leg and sustained a sword cut to the forehead. The last thing she wanted to do was see a doctor, but because of her injuries, she found herself in a physician's care. Lucky for her, he only addressed the cut on her head. Deborah used a penknife to dig the musket shot out of her thigh, removing almost all of the shot. During the summer of 1783, Samson fell unconscious due to fever and was treated by Dr. Barnabas Binney. Dr. Binney removed her clothes to treat her and discovered the cloth she had used to bind her breasts. Taking mercy to keep her secret quiet, he took her to his house, where his wife, daughters, and a female nurse cared for her. After her recovery, Dr. Binney gave a note for Deborah to deliver to General Patterson. Deborah knew that the note would reveal her secret, undoubtedly bringing punishment upon her, but she delivered it anyway. To her surprise, the general simply gave her an honorable discharge, a note with some advice, and enough money for her to travel home. Deborah went on to marry Benjamin Gannett, a Sharon, Massachusetts farmer. She would travel to speak on her wartime services. Unfortunately, her and her husband were unable to pay their debts, so they would frequently borrow money from their friend Paul Revere. In 1804, Revere wrote to the U.S. Representative William Eustis of Massachusetts on Samson's behalf, requesting a pension, something that had never been done for a woman.
I have been induced to inquire her situation and character, since she quit the male habit and soldier's uniform for the more decent apparel of her own gender. Humanity and justice obliges me to say that every person with whom I have conversed about her, and it is not a few, speak of her as a woman with handsome talents, good morals, a dutiful wife, and an affectionate parent.
On March 11, 1805, Congress approved the request and placed Samson on the Massachusetts Invalid Pension Roll at the rate of $4 a month. In 1809, she petitioned Congress again, this time that her pension should include back pay from her discharge in 1783. Congress initially denied her, but in 1816 awarded her $76 a year, which equates roughly to $1,500 in today's dollars. Samson died of yellow fever on April 29, 1827. She was buried at Rock Ridge Cemetery in Sharon, Massachusetts. And as of 2000, the town flag of Plimpton incorporates Samson as the official heroine of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Although these weren't the only ladies who helped shape America, their courage and contributions were critical in shaping a new nation. Some fought on the battlefield, some on the home front, and others in court and the education system, carving a trail for many of the women to come who had earned their place in history.